One of the things that I struggle with the most when it comes to appreciating most forms of media, especially older ones, are the ever-increasing standards associated with them. Like, I'm well aware that from my current perspective, and even from when I was a kid, that many things were the best they'd ever been and were only going to get better from there. See, I'm a 90s kid, I was born in 1990, and the entirety of my most formative years happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. So how things were in that time frame was essentially my baseline. Like, yeah, I did play some of the games that came around before I was born, but I never experienced much of the third or fourth generations of consoles firsthand during their heyday. The Game Boy was my first game system with a carefully curated library, and the N64 was the first console I bought with my own money. So at least to some degree, I've always had the perspective that many games prior to that point were somehow inherently simpler, more archaic, and less likely to be fun, as unfair as that perspective may be. I had a particularly difficult time trying to appreciate the NES era's games. Developers and console makers were still testing the waters, trying to figure out what can work in a video game at this point, so more than any point beyond it, that generation was filled with experiments that never fully panned out, or ambitions that could only be half realized. And since I was so used to games having a certain baseline of functionality and design, my desire to explore those games was limited at best. So with that in mind, it probably wouldn't surprise you to hear that for the majority of my childhood and adolescence, of all of Nintendo's most famous franchises, Metroid was the one that I had the least exposure to overall. Now, I did know about Metroid. I had played Super Smash Bros. After all, and Metroid Prime was one of the first games I got for my GameCube when I did buy that. But aside from the Metroid Prime sub-series, I didn't really have much experience with Metroid until well into adulthood after Super Metroid got added to the Wii Virtual Console. That's not necessarily for a lack of trying, however. I did end up playing the NES Metroid back in that era. I don't remember exactly how. I think I unlocked it in Metroid Prime using an action replay since it was included as an extra in that game. I was excited to try it, especially considering how much I loved Prime. I wanted to see where this series started out, but I did not end up having nearly as good of an experience. I bounced off it incredibly hard. There was not a single thing I liked about Metroid when I first played it, and I got about 20 minutes in before shutting it off to go play Melee instead. I just couldn't handle it. The movement was slow and hard to control, a far cry from even other NES games that I did enjoy like Super Mario Bros. 3. The world was convoluted and seemingly intentionally obtuse, made even worse due to there not being a map, and even if I could know where I was going, I had no idea what I had to do. So yeah, I stopped playing and left it alone for a while, thinking that this series, at least the 2D iteration of it, just wasn't for me. This scene repeated a few times throughout the years, with my dislike of the game becoming more and more concrete every time I tried to give it a shot. I would start it up, get a little bit into the game, hit a wall, and give up. And that became increasingly frustrating for me because in the time since, I'd experienced many other games in the Metroid series and have grown to love them. So it's not the idea of Metroid that I can't get behind or anything, there's something specific about this first game that I wasn't able to mesh with, and I want to dig deeper into that to try to figure out exactly what it is. Is there truly anything about this game that is actually bad, or am I just being blinded by how much better everything else is nowadays? So let's talk about Metroid and see what made its ideas so long-lasting. Was it just a fluke, or is there something here that's deserving of being revered as the origin of a genre? Let's find out. And just before we get started here, if you like what I do and want to help out, like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you really want to go above and beyond, you can join my Patreon. You'll see these videos a week in advance, get exclusive updates, and even occasionally get an exclusive video. Alright, plug over. So when you start the game, if you wait on the title screen for a bit, you get to see what our protagonist's mission here is. The Galaxy Federal Police has issued an emergency order to Samus Aran to defeat the Metroid of the planet Zebeth and destroy the mother brain, the mechanical life vein? Well, that doesn't really explain much. Yeah, this was before game translation started to be even the slightest bit passable, so we'll see what the manual says instead. In the far off distant future year of 2000. I'm not gonna tell him. A galactic federation was formed to become a sort of centralized government for the galaxy. Unfortunately, with interconnected travel and commerce comes pirates, and these space pirates have started causing chaos amongst the different societies in the Federation. So the Federation, unable to solve their own problems, have enlisted the skills of bounty hunters to do their jobs for them. Now it's the year 20X5, and the space pirates have captured some cargo that supposedly contains an unknown life form, which was found on the desolate planet SR-388, and have taken it to their base on the planet Zebes. This life form, named Metroid by the Federation, is supposedly very dangerous and is thought to have wiped out the entire civilization on SR-388, so keeping it in control is paramount, as if it were used by the space pirates as a weapon, it may be able to wipe out all life in the galaxy. Out of options, because doing things on their own is hard, the Federation has tasked Samus Aran to infiltrate the base and destroy Mother Brain, the space pirates' leader. Samus is the only one able to do this because he is a cyborg, strengthened with robotics, giving him superpowers? I guess they didn't really have a lore bible set up for the series at this point. Actually, this was totally done on purpose. Sure, some of this stuff was kinda wonky 80s translation stuff, but describing Samus as a man was intentionally done to bury the lead, to make sure that the eventual reveal of her being a woman was a surprise to people who played the game back during its original release window. Samus wasn't originally designed as a woman, this was a change made about halfway through the game's development, but the team thought it would be a good idea, so they made the change, and I'm really glad that they did. Samus being a woman is arguably just as important and influential as anything else this game did for the industry as a whole. Anyways, with the setup out of the way, let's get into the game. So when you start, Samus appears within the depths of Zebes, and this first section is super interesting. Now, I'm sure that everyone who's covered this game has talked to this part to death, but I'm gonna join the crowd because it's too well designed to ignore. This section teaches the player a few very important lessons that were pretty unique to this game at the time. See, in this era, and I'm specifically talking mid-80s here, game conventions evolved extremely quickly, though typically platformers were very simple. You'd start out on one side of the level, and you'd move to the other side with very little reason to ever worry about going back to what you've moved past. Heck, Super Mario Bros. Didn't even let you move backwards through a level. But Metroid is a very different type of game, and the developers needed to instill that in players right away. So just like any other platformer, you could go to the right as soon as you start, and that seems like the right way, at least for a while, but you'll soon reach an impasse and have to backtrack. That's a big enough deal on its own, but eventually you'll make your way back to the start, and with nowhere else to go, you'll head left beyond the starting point, where you'll find the Morphing Ball power-up, which lets you progress into the larger world. This is such smart level design because it teaches the players two very important lessons right away that not only help navigate this game, but will also eventually become tenets of the newly created genre as a whole. 1. The obvious path forward isn't always correct, and 2. Retracing your steps can be extremely beneficial. We definitely take this for granted nowadays because pretty much every game does this sort of thing now, but this sort of world design was far from a given when Metroid first released, so it was a really smart decision to teach the player through gameplay how the experience was going to work. This was going to be a slower, more exploratory experience, a maze the player would have to navigate through, not purely a skill-based test. So obviously this excellent design is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to show up time and time again throughout the experience, right? Before we get further into the level design, we need to talk about Samus herself and moving her around because boy, it is not exactly what I would call super smooth. At the start of the game, you can only do 3 things: move left and right, jump, and shoot. This is far from uncommon for the era, and there's nothing inherently bad about it conceptually, but there's a few things that make controlling Samus feel pretty bad. First is how slow she moves, or I guess more correctly, how slow she feels. Moving around, it feels like Samus is moving way slower than she should be, and that gives the game a sluggish feel that never really goes away, even ignoring the near constant slowdown the game experiences when more than like 3 things are on screen. Her jumping also feels pretty bad. I guess it sells the illusion of Samus being this big diesel-powered robot attempting acrobatics because she feels lumbering and awkward, and moving around can occasionally be pretty frustrating. I think the platform placement is a big part of this as well. It feels somewhat haphazard, like Samus's abilities weren't considered at all when designing rooms. Of course, the enemies are designed to exploit this as much as possible. Enemy patterns, while simple, often align just right to make avoiding damage pretty much impossible, and there's more than its fair share of bugs too. Being hit or even killed through door transitions happened way more than I ever thought it could. But aside from the general clunkiness of Samus's movement, the real thing that most people are going to notice when first playing Metroid is Samus's beam cannon, which is basically the most pathetic excuse for a weapon I've ever seen in a game. Not only does it only shoot a tiny distance in front of Samus, forcing her to be closer to enemies that can tear her to shreds, but it can only be shot in two directions, forward and up. Even after you get the long beam that lets Samus shoot the entire length of the screen, her beam still ends up feeling terrible to use. And at a glance, that feels weird, right? For instance, Mega Man's Buster Cannon in his first game can only be shot forward, you don't even get the luxury to shoot up. So what's the problem? Why is that weapon perfectly usable and Samus's beam cannon so terrible? Well, for one, Mega Man is a much swifter character to control, so the limitations don't feel as much like hindrances. On top of that, a huge number of enemies that Samus comes across during the game are just short enough that her beam can never hit them when they're on the ground, so even shooting at them is a waste of time. Now, this does get remedied somewhat as the game goes on, as more enemies fly rather than crawl, in order to not make Metroid too jealous, I'm sure. And ground-based enemies become more manageable with the Morph Ball bombs and the Wave Beam. The Wave Beam in particular does feel like a pretty substantial upgrade if you can find it. You can move around a lot more confidently when you know that ankle biters aren't likely to literally kill you. Now, I know a lot of this was done on purpose. This is supposed to be a really dangerous mission. Samus is infiltrating the base of the space pirates and all odds are stacked against her. It's supposed to be an incredibly hostile environment, one which Samus hasn't been able to fully prepare for, and the game does manage to pull that off. I definitely don't think Samus was the right person for this job based on her starting loadout, but in practice, I didn't really feel like it was the world or enemies doing me in. Whenever I died in my first playthrough, I never felt like the space pirates defeated Samus. It felt like mistakes were forced upon me a lot more than I would have hoped, mistakes that wouldn't have happened in a game that controlled better. Now, as I've done more playthroughs, I've learned the ins and outs of Samus's controls more, and I'm obviously less likely to die, but I still never feel fully in control, you know? The next thing most people are going to notice when first trying this game is the map, or rather, the lack thereof. Now, maps and minimaps are something we definitely take for granted nowadays. They're so ubiquitous that they even show up in games that don't really need them all that much, but back in the 80s, in the era of password systems and no on-cartridge saving, maps that showed where you are and where you've been were at best a rarity, and the few games that did have them, like The Legend of Zelda, were quite limited in their functionality in-game. Games kind of forced players to rely on themselves for navigation, and that's one of the things that really held me back when I first played Metroid. Zebes is a huge maze, and if you aren't keeping track of landmarks and tracking where you've been, you'll get very lost very quickly. However, the biggest issue really only pops up if you're like me and are playing the game for the first time many years after the original release and don't have the game's manual. See, the manual has this handy approximation of the game world, and just having this to act on as a rough guide was huge for me. Thanks to this map, I right away know that going left at the top of the main vertical corridor will take me to Turian, which is the end game. It tells me that this room here will take me down into Kraid's lair once I get the ability to destroy the blocks. It tells me that both Norfair and Ridley's lair are accessed at the bottom of Brinstar, and that Brinstar itself is split into 3 main pathways, the bottom of which leads to that Norfair path. That's actually a huge amount of information, and while it doesn't go into any details, no room-to-room information here, the information it does give is more than enough for me to go on, for me to actually start going out there and exploring this world. Of course, I wanted my own more detailed, complete map, so I got my old friend graph paper out and drew my own. It is far from correct, I'm sure I made a ton of mistakes, but it gave me all the information I needed to help me navigate this world as I went. This actually did make the process of exploration quite a bit more fun than you'd have probably expected it to. For all intents and purposes, this is busy work that pretty much no player-focused game would make you go through in the modern era. Every time you have to draw another room, that's another few seconds you're not playing the game, but I think this actually did a ton to help me keep my bearings. Obviously, I could just glance down at my map anytime I wanted to get a general idea as to where I was and what paths I needed needed to take to get to somewhere else, but the fact that I was taking the time to draw out this map and paying such close attention to where I was going actually gave me a much better mental map than I would have had otherwise. Obviously not a perfect one, but we'll get into that later. I also had a ton of fun drawing the map itself. That's not something that I expect to be the norm though. Cartography was a bit of a hobby of mine as a kid, and I had fun diving back into something that I hadn't done in a while. Now, getting a bit further into the game, I think it starts out pretty strong. Brinstar is the first area we move through, and I think it's really good. It's pretty straightforward, has a lot of unique areas that make for some good mental landmarks, and utilizes the two lessons the game taught pretty well. As I said, Brinstar has 3 main corridors you can go through from the main tower. The first one you see when entering the area will take you through a bunch of enemies to an energy tank, a hugely important upgrade to get early on, and will eventually lead to another tower with a door you can't enter and a bunch of enemies you can't do anything about. The top one is a dead end for now, but seems to be pretty important, and the bottom one leads down to Norfair after rewarding Samus with her first missile upgrade. But while I do like this area overall and see how well it starts to expand on what the opening area established, I also pretty much immediately started to notice the cracks in the world design. While everything here is functional, I feel like Metroid commits one of its biggest sins most egregiously here, and that is in how vaguely it conveys its intended progression and how that lack of proper guidance prevents the game from teaching more of its important lessons more effectively. So like I said, as you explore Brinstar, you'll quickly find a few doors that you can't enter. One in the blue tower area, and if you take the main corridor in Brinstar, one in the far tower. After finding my first set of missiles, because I had some experience with this series, I knew exactly what to do with them. I went back to the blue tower to find the long beam, which actually lets Samus use her ranged weapon from range. A revolutionary concept, I'm sure. Then I went to the other door I found earlier, and after some missile drop grinding, I found the Morph Ball Bomb. This is where things start to go wrong. See, earlier in the corridor there's a set of rooms which look pretty innocuous at first. There's nothing of note here except for an enemy flying beneath the floor. Having just found the Morph Ball Bombs, I was eager to try them out to see if there was something hidden underneath the floor that I could get to. And sure enough, in the first room that I tried them out in as I was heading back to the main crossroads, there was. Dropping down into this area, I discovered a hidden set of rooms that led to the Ice Beam. That's awesome, the Ice Beam is a great power-up and I was happy to have it. So with the next power-up acquired, I was ready to move on. At least until I tried to get out of the pit. When I tried to jump out, no matter what I did, I just couldn't do it. It was too high for my jump and I was soft-locked. Now, not wanting to have to just die, I did end up looking this up online and found that you can damage boost out of the pit when the destructible block reforms, but using that method just didn't feel right to me, and neither did standing around waiting for enemies to make Samus explode. Like, there's no way the developers put this in the game and decided that the correct progression method for a first-time player required you to either die or use an exploit to get out. See, I don't think the game actually wants you to find this so early or even maybe at all during your first playthrough. It's just that the proper way to find the Ice Beam is way more esoteric and hard to come across for players normally. Here's my theory. After getting the long beam, head to the Morph Ball Bombs as usual. Then, with nothing else to go on, since you wouldn't know that Morph Ball Bombs can destroy regular floor blocks yet, head down into Norfair. Once there, head into this corridor which introduces the idea of hidden paths in walls by destroying normal, non-obvious blocks with your beam and bombs. With that knowledge now gained, head back from the corridor and right outside that door, discover the path down to the high jump boots. With them, you can then head up in that same tower area which you couldn't reach before, and after finding a few more hidden blocks which you now know to look for, you can find these rooms that eventually lead directly to an entirely different instance of the Ice Beam. Then, with the Ice Beam in tow, you can head back up to Brinstar, climb up the far right tower using the Ice Beam to freeze enemies into platforms, which will eventually lead you to the room with the Varia suit. That feels like the intended route because it follows a pretty obvious path of logic and doesn't require any major guesswork. However, if the internet is to be believed, most people are like me and find themselves in the secondary Ice Beam Brinstar death pit immediately after getting the bombs. Pretty much every guide I've seen online while researching this video has the Ice Beam as the next upgrade after bombs. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this second Ice Beam shouldn't exist or anything, I genuinely love that it's there. See, Metroid is an incredibly non-linear and open game, even compared to some later games in the series. It's built in a way that lets you wander, lets you explore the world and find things at your own pace, and beyond the first roadblock at the start of the game and the missile doors, it almost never truly blocks your ability to explore. Like, if you want to head directly into Kraid's lair immediately after getting the Morph Ball bombs, before even touching Norfair, you can do that. You probably won't have any fun, but you can do it. Beyond that, pretty much none of the items you can find, from the long beam to the screw attack, are required for progression at all. The goal of the game is to infiltrate Turian and defeat Mother Brain, and in order to do that, all you need to do is defeat Kraid and Ridley to access Turian, and find the ice beam to take out the Metroids that inhabit Turian with Mother Brain. Everything else you do while checking off those 3 boxes is entirely optional, and are only there to reward exploration and make achieving those goals easier. And that's why I'm so torn on this ice beam placement here. On subsequent playthroughs, I loved being able to find it, being able to get such an important tool so early. It really helped me change how I would approach the game. But it really is a beginner's trap. If you aren't already in the know, don't already know how to get out of that pit, you're just punished with an almost guaranteed death. Speaking of which, while there are many design decisions I've come to appreciate about this game during the process of making this video, there's one thing that I will never understand, and that's how viciously punishing it is when you do die. So when you start the game, obviously Samus starts out without any missiles and just her basic beam cannon, but what's more important is her starting health. Rather than starting at full HP like any other game would do, Samus instead starts out at 30 of her maximum 99 energy, and that's hugely important to how you're forced to play the game. You are able to build her up to maximum with drops from enemies, but the easiest and best way to get an HP fill up is to pick up an energy tank. Not only do these increase your maximum energy by 100, but every energy tank will bring you back up to your maximum every time. However, those are the only way to get a full energy refill. If you don't have easy access to an energy tank and you die, you'll start again at the beginning of an area with that same 30 energy. It doesn't matter if you already have 6 energy tanks, or if you're in Ridley's lair where enemies will be able to take you out in 2 or 3 hits even with the Variasuit, you start at 30 energy. This can lead to situations where a player's ability to explore and progress is severely limited, and they'll need to grind up health on enemy spawners. Unfortunately though, that's not even what I'd consider an amazing option, because sure, that is a possibility, but enemy spawners are kind of a trap. You can kill enemies on them for drops, yeah, but the frame a drop has been picked up, a new enemy will spawn, and you can very easily just end up getting hit anyways, making their usefulness dubious at best. You're often better off hoping you come across an energy tank for a refill instead. Now the game is somewhat clever with how it handles these energy tanks. Since your energy maxes out at 6, but there are 8 energy tanks to be found, it encourages you to have a pretty interesting relationship with them. In my first playthrough, I just took them as I found them and was just happy to have the extras as a full HP refill. There are energy tanks conveniently placed near both Kraid and Ridley's boss arenas, so that was nice. However, on my second playthrough, I started to think about them much more strategically. Some survival horror games have adapted a system where the amount of times you can save your game is limited, and it's up to the player to decide if they're capable of making a push to the next area on what little resources they have, or if they need to save, which would make things easier for them in the short term, but may make things more difficult in the long term. On replays of Metroid, I kinda started thinking about energy tanks like those limited saves. Like, yeah, I could grab the energy tank at the start of the game as soon as I get the ice beam, but it may be more suited as a final refill after I've defeated Kraid and Ridley and I'm about to head into Turian. Now, they were probably not meant to be thought of so strategically. They probably just put more than you needed in the game in order to make it more likely that you actually end up at max health by time you go into Turian, especially if you missed some of the more well-hidden ones, but hey, an accidental good design decision is still a good design decision. Anyways, once I found my way into Norfair, I really started to notice how the game's level design quality falls off a cliff. Brinstar offered a good number of unique areas and rooms, which did a lot to keep the very simple level design more interesting, but if there's 3 words that can sum up Norfair, those words are copy and paste. Norfair is full of so many rooms that are literally identical, often placed right next to each other. I'd enter a new corridor and get really confused because I was sure that I'd already been through it before, only to find new power-ups that I hadn't picked up, because the set of rooms rooms I was traveling through are just copies placed to pad out the area and make it larger without putting any more effort into it. Having the physical map here is basically essential because you can't tell where you are in Norfair at a glance, at least without a ton of backtracking to more recognizable rooms. Norfair is easily my least favorite area in the game because of this, and one thing that it did in particular was kind of shatter the image I had built up for the game in my head. Metroid has a bit of a reputation of being obtuse, esoteric, and hard to wrap your head around because, at least on the surface, it kind of is. There are loads of hidden passageways, items, and more. But a lot of that really is just on the surface. It seems incomprehensible and nearly infinite. But as I was exploring Norfair, all of that grandeur and mystique just evaporated. The fact that so many rooms are copies of one another is a big reason for this. When a room gets copied, all of its features get copied too, and that includes any destructible blocks or hidden passages. So while I was exploring around Norfair, whenever I saw a room like this, I immediately knew, from previous experience with similar rooms, that there would be destructible blocks here and here. Now, not literally every time or anything, but it happened frequently enough that I was able to expect them, and the placement of hidden blocks never changed in any given room layout. So if the block I was expecting to be destructible wasn't, I knew right away that there was nothing else hidden. That's actually how I managed to find the screw attack. This room obviously had a passage up, so I used it and immediately found the passage to the screw attack. That's not to say that all of these rooms have usable secrets. Often when you try to bomb out a destructible block, you'll find yourself in a secret passage that leads to nowhere. Heck, every Chozo statue has destructible blocks that lead underneath them, and none of them lead to anything interesting except for the one passage it was actually made for, the high jump boots room. And there's also just a few rooms that are awful to play through, specifically these rooms with the large bubble towers. There are a few sections here where if you fall into them, you're just stuck and have no other option but to die. I actually got stuck in one of the smaller pits here in both of my original playthroughs and still almost died trying to get out. These sorts of instant death traps in games like this are just inexcusable. However, they aren't even close to my least favorite room in the game. That goes comfortably to the room just before Kraid's boss fight in his lair. Whoever built this room is evil. Entering it before Kraid is fine, just fall all the way down, no problem. The issue is going back up. Instead of designing a set of platforms for you to actually use to get back up from Kraid's room, you have to use this tower of one wide destructible blocks. This is an enormous tower that takes a few minutes to get to the top of normally, but if you mistime a jump or anything and a block decides to reform on top of you, 90% of the time you just get flung to the side off of it and have no choice but to fall all the way back down and try again. I hate this room so much. This is probably my least favorite room in any video game ever, and it serves no real purpose aside from causing a burning frustration and wasting my time. Kraid's Lair is kinda like that in general. It has loads of copy-pasted rooms, and unlike Norfair, which occasionally rewards your exploration with new items and stuff, outside of a few things at the very start, there's really nothing for you to even find. At the very least, it is quite a lot smaller than Norfair. Now, I do sympathize with the developers here and understand why they had to build the world the way they did. This was a team of people who had never made a full game, rushing to meet a deadline to get the game out at all, and this was their solution. Cutting and pasting rooms allowed the team to give Metroid a scale they were satisfied with without pushing the scope of the project way outside the realms of feasibility. What they managed to achieve with such little time and experience is impressive, but the fact that they were forced to cut corners in order to make the game at all doesn't make those corners any less cut, and the harsh drop-off in quality from Brinstar to Norfair and Kraid's Lair really negatively impacts the overall experience. Ridley's Lair, thankfully, is a lot closer to Brinstar in quality than Norfair. It's a much smaller, more linear set of rooms, all eventually leading to Ridley himself, but beyond that, each room feels like it's much more deliberately designed. There's more unique rooms, more unique secrets and tricks, and even has unique enemies and traps that aren't found anywhere else in the game. It makes the trip to Ridley feel much more climactic, like the game is trying to sell the threat and his importance by giving him unique challenges, whereas Kraid's Lair was just more of what we've already seen, but kinda worse. On the topic of the bosses themselves, frankly, all three of them are terrible. Kraid is kinda just annoying since he'll keep knocking Samus away with his projectiles, making it harder to properly defeat him. Constantly dropping bombs feels like the best way to tackle him. Ridley is significantly easier, completely undermining the great work his lair did to build him up. You just need to run up to this chest-high wall, Gears of War style, then stand still and shoot missiles until he dies. Now, I know that this wasn't really an era where bosses were all that complex or interesting, especially in games that weren't purely about fighting bosses, but man, I just can't help but be completely underwhelmed. There are regular enemies that put up more of a fight than these two. Heck, Ridley didn't even hit me. Even enemy spawners are able to get a few blows in on Samus every once in a while. Anyways, defeating Kraid and Ridley does two main things. First is that they both reward Samus with a bunch of extra missiles, 150 total, and they will be necessary for what's to come. Second is defeating both bosses generates the bridge required to enter into Turian, and with them defeated, it's finally time to head down into Turian and take out Mother Brain. But before we do that, there's a few more things that I want to talk about first, primarily the presentation. As an early NES game, I can't really expect the visual presentation to be all that mind-blowing, but I feel like Metroid does a few cool things to elevate the experience beyond a lot of its contemporaries. First and foremost is the use of negative space. Rather than attempting to fill up the screen in color to make backgrounds, Metroid chooses to leave all of the backgrounds entirely black, and that does a ton to sell the game's atmosphere. Samus is descending down into the depths of planet Zebes. It's obviously going to be dark, and beyond selling the darkness, leaving the backgrounds black sells the size of the world. Like, it's so large that even looking straight on into the distance, everything is so far away that you can't even see it. I also appreciate how the game uses the colors that it does have. Each area has its own set of unique colors and sprites, which sets them all apart pretty well, all things considered. For instance, the starting area is colored with a pale blue surrounding the void, making it feel cold and lifeless. Like this is a part of the planet that the space pirates don't visit often or leave fairly unprotected. They're confident enough that Turian is safeguarded by Kraid and Ridley, so they don't even have to pay attention to it. Then once you enter Brinstar proper, the colors change to yellow, giving the areas a brighter, more lived-in feel. These areas, especially the towers, are effectively identical, but they manage to feel pretty different due to well-chosen color schemes, and the color choices benefit every area of the game. The sprites themselves are fine. The platforms, walls, and ceiling tiles all look pretty good, but I can't really say that the visual fidelity extends to other features of the game. Some of the enemies look good, especially some of the ones in Ridley's lair, but most of them are kind of just there. They do the job, of course, but hardly stand out visually. And yeah, Samus herself looks pretty much awful here. Her proportions are weird, she's only got 3 frames of animation while running, her spin jump looks awful, and she's just a terrible looking character. She doesn't even really have any pixel shading on her, which would have at least given her sprite some appearance of depth. Environment sprites have plenty of this, so Samus ends up feeling particularly flat and out of place next to them. Kraid and Ridley sprites also look awful. I guess they couldn't dedicate enough sprite memory to make them large enough to be properly imposing and threatening, so we got the Samus height facsimiles of what the manual art suggests they would be. On the audio side of things, the music in particular is pretty interesting. It was composed by Hip Tanaka, which is a name I'm sure some people recognize but may not know from where. He started off as a composer for Nintendo in the 80s, doing a bunch of music for their games from Donkey Kong to Metroid to Tetris, and later became the president of Creatures Inc. for like 20 years, which is wild to me that the person that composed Metroid went on to be the president of a company that co-owns Pokemon. Talk about career development. Anyways, what I think Tanaka did best with the music here was create an atmosphere. Like, you probably wouldn't be able to listen to Norfair's theme and think there was a banger of a melody there. But it really helps elevate the experience of navigating the lava-filled bubble land a ton. That's not to say that the game as a whole is lacking in melodic music or anything, since that's absolutely not the case. Kraid's lair is iconic, and for good reason. And Brinstar's theme is just so well known and encompasses what Metroid is so well. I don't think the Metroid series would be as beloved as it is without Tanaka's music. He created the sound that would guide the series' future composers forever. And with that, it's about time we wrap this up. We've beaten Kraid, we've trounced Ridley, and all that's left to do is infiltrate Turian and take down Mother Brain. Let's go. So once in Turian, my previous knowledge of the series showed up and I knew exactly what to do. The Metroid enemies here are incredibly aggressive and will latch onto Samus if she gives them the chance, draining her energy as they do. In order to defeat them, you need to use the Ice Beam to freeze them, and once frozen, destroy them with missiles. This is a pretty interesting area and gets more and more dangerous as you go. More Metroids will appear, and making things worse, Turian is full of defense systems that will shoot energy rings at Samus. It's a gauntlet, and if you're not careful, you can be worn down very easily here. You really need to make sure you keep yourself healthy because you'll need every last drop of energy and every missile you have for the final showdown. Once you enter Mother Brain's room, you have to break through several regenerating barriers with missiles, and upon reaching her, blast her until she's down. This entire boss fight and arena is so incredibly annoying. You can only do decent damage to Mother Brain from pretty close up, and since bullets and energy rings are constantly flying at you, you're just gonna get knocked down into lava at pretty much every possible opportunity. It's not particularly difficult, and you're not likely to die if you're being careful at all, but it's just such a pain in the ass. And once she's down, all that's left to do is escape the soon-to-be self-destructing space pirate base. This is meant to be one final test of platforming, and I guess it is, but god, I did not have any fun with this. Again, it's not particularly difficult because the game gives you loads of time to escape, but Samus's floaty, hard to control jump mixed together with these tiny, awkwardly placed platforms is just so annoying. Once we reach the top, Samus takes the elevator, and with the mission complete, she takes her power suit off to reveal what she really looks like. I was promised a cyborg. I'm very disappointed. Actually, this is another one of Metroid's most interesting decisions. As we all know now, Samus isn't some He-Man cyborg, she's a woman, and having that revelation be a reward for beating the game was really clever, subverting people's expectations of who the hero is at the very end of the game. This fact gets more obvious the faster you beat the game too, since she takes off more of her suit the lower your completion time. Now obviously this is also a product of its era. Having the main reward for beating the game be basically an 8-bit pinup wouldn't exactly fly in 2025, but in practice what it really does is just encourage people to keep playing the game to get better at it. Its many secrets and optional resources do an amazing job of letting people experiment, crafting their own routes through the maze and doing what they can to whittle that time down to become speedrunners. This philosophy would be perfected later on in the series, but it plants a lot of the seeds here, and in retrospect, it comes across as a lot more forward thinking than it was probably ever intended to be. And that was Metroid. I dunno, I think the climax of the game is kind of underwhelming overall. Sure, invading Turian and fighting the Metroids is fine, but the Mother Brain fight and the escape just don't really do it for me, and put a bit of a damper on the ending, which is really unfortunate because this is a game that's already full of dampers. This was a very ambitious title, especially for the time, and they had a great idea as to what they wanted to accomplish, but they just weren't able to have it fully coalesce into a truly satisfying experience. Obviously, the elements that make this genre so beloved today are here: the large, expansive world, the progressive upgrades that make exploring the world fuller and easier as you go, the open and non-linear setup that encourages you to backtrack, keep mental or physical notes of places you've been and places you can't quite reach yet, the works. But it's weighed down by the inability to fully realize those concepts. Sure, the world is huge and expansive, but it's filled to the brim with pointless rooms that offer nothing of substance. Yeah, the game encourages exploration, but once you've figured out how it does its secrets, there's nothing left to discover. All of its mysteries are surface deep. Its main saving grace is that open, non-linear setup that encourages replayability, but even that can't be fully realized because its world has so few cards up its sleeve. When I went into this game, I was expecting to hate it, because every other time I tried to get into it, I hated it. But I think that hatred was largely because I was approaching it with my biases a little more at the forefront and not seeing it for what it really was. I was expecting a game that could guide me like Metroid Prime, or could be played with as much finesse as Super Mario Bros. 3, but obviously those expectations aren't fair. This is a game of its era, and every other time I tried to play Metroid, I simply didn't have the resources I need to actually dive into it properly. Now that I have, I definitely see why some people revere it as much as they do. Its ideas were revolutionary, and as rocky as the implementation of those ideas were, I still do understand why it was so successful at the time, and even now. That being said, I still don't think I really like it very much. Its ideas are great, but it's just so rough in so many areas. The level design is great until it's terrible, the bosses are all jokes, it's incredibly punishing to new players, even punishing their curiosity, which is like the main reason to play a game like this. I genuinely respect its contributions to Nintendo and the industry as a whole. Metroid has become iconic and was one of the first games to have a female protagonist, but its biggest influence happened much later. Metroid's ideas were so unique and resonated so much with so many people that it became the origin and namesake of an entire genre. However, over time that genre has surpassed everything that Metroid had attempted time and time again, and ultimately it's been left as a bit of a relic of a bygone era. A game that is mostly going to be approached as a historical curiosity, as an origin point for something far greater than itself. But of course, Nintendo wasn't going to be satisfied with just creating a genre, they were going to be the ones to refine it and turn it into something incredible as well. And like any good experiment, there were bound to be some speed bumps. 5 years after releasing Metroid on the NES, a sequel was made for Nintendo's first great handheld, the Game Boy, and it has gotten an incredibly complicated reputation. Next time, we'll tackle Samus's return with the first of many black sheep in this franchise, Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Thank you all so much for watching. And just before I end the video, I want to thank my amazing paid Patreon members, R.A. Miller, Louis G, Nick Ulrich, Adora Shark, James Fish, Ryan Powell, Lucky Wonderfish, Creeping Briar, Matthew Lorigan, Dom, Benjamin Iliff, Anthony, and Prometheus. You're all the best. Thank you so much.